Well, I really want to speak with you about, philosophy, of course. You do philosophy, your husband's a philosopher. So I wanted to ask you the role of it, why it's important. But first, how did you first get into philosophy? I know you got your degree, your PhD in English.
Right, right. Well, so I've broken into actually three different fields in a non-traditional way. Um, when my husband and I got married, he was getting his undergraduate degree in philosophy, and I was interested in literature, but I only had a Bible college degree background. So I became a self-taught student of English literature and world literature. And then that enabled me, after we moved to Nashville for him to take his PhD in philosophy, it enabled me to get a fellowship to study English also at Vanderbilt. So, I got good enough test scores and so forth because of my self-study.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, our idea was that we were going to, study these different fields and kind of be in different areas academically. But I was always interested in philosophy, and he talked to me constantly. We didn't have any children at that time. We'd spent a lot of time together. He constantly talked to me about his work in philosophy and his dissertation, what he was writing, and I did the same in English. So when he got one job in Washington State, then he got a job here in Kalamazoo, Michigan. We've been here all that time. Of course, I was a an at-home mom at that point. We'd had our first child, and it was very much a publisher parish uh, atmosphere, in philosophy, as it still is. And he didn't have tenure, so we were both like, he needs to publish, he had published one book by that time. His dissertation had been published as a book. But I was just so interested in his fields that he and I in began co-writing in philosophy. And at some point in here also I had submitted an article in English literature and I got it accepted, but with a backhanded letter from the editor. The editor was sort of publishing it against his will or something, I don't know. And I had used the phrase canons of evidence in my article. And in this weird acceptance letter that I got from the editor, he said, "What are these canons of evidence that you're talking about?" And mind you, this was a conservative academically in the field of English. This was not some postmodernist. But even so, he was like, what do you mean canons of evidence? And I can still remember standing and looking at that letter, physical letter, and saying, this is not the field I want to continue in. Because I knew that I was way more committed to canons of evidence than I was to publishing in English. So, with all those different influences, we began co-publishing. But that was a strain. Co-writing is hard. It's really hard because each person has to go over what they're what they're writing and be settled with it, confident, like the way it's written. Tim is a
Mhm.
better writer than I am, actually. He writes beautifully, even better than I do, but he writes more slowly, so that caused differences in method. So eventually, after we published our article on the resurrection of Jesus, which contained a lot of interesting probability theory material, we were both getting more deeply into Bayesian probability. I just felt confident enough to go off and start publishing single written articles. And if he contributed something, of course I always gave him credit, in a footnote, something he had helped me with or whatever, but the articles were written by me. And so since then, since like the 20 teens or so, I've been publishing philosophy articles on my own. And thanks to the double-blind review process in philosophy, which I think has been really good, my status as an independent scholar was not usually counted against me. All of those kinds of things, like who are you,
Mhm.
was not an issue. And so then I've got quite a good length resume now, publication resume. So that's my breaking into my second field in a non-traditional way. And then the third field was New Testament studies, but you didn't ask about that. So we've got to how I became a published philosopher.
Right. And you picked epistemology really as the branch of philosophy that you kind of specialize in. Why? Why that branch?
Well, first of all, it's important to know that there are two different kinds of epistemology, even so, and even within the analytic philosophy field, there's what's sometimes called classical epistemology, where you don't use any math, you don't use any numbers, but you draw these little diagrams, these little evidence trees, and so forth. And that's where Tim and I started in classical epistemology. And then there's formal epistemology, which is what we moved to. So there are, different stories there. Um, Very early on, even when Tim was the only one working in philosophy formally, he and I came to the conclusion that from an individual perspective, epistemology is primary. Metaphysics can go hand in hand, but you start with what you yourself know. That's a very Cartesian thing to say, of
Yeah.
course, but what you have access to. And there's a position in apologetics, in sort of Christian apologetics, called presuppositionalism.
Yeah.
And something that a lot of people don't know about me is that I was a presuppositionalist when I went to Bible college. That was what was taught at my Bible college. Now, that's the same Bible college where Tim's father taught all his working life. I never took a course with his father, as it happens, but Tim had become an evidentialist very early on. And when we were dating and essentially engaged, we were both very young. I was only 20 when we got married. He was only 21 when we got married. So like I was in my late teens when we were dating, but I was still a presuppositionalist. And a presuppositionalist says it's like all these things. If you don't start with God, you won't end with God.
Yeah.
Um, the believer and the non-believer are never on the same playing field, blah, blah, blah. Okay.
It's these kind of
And
transcendental arguments.
they will use transcendental arguments. The only argument they like, actually, and I'm not even saying there's nothing to be said for that. C.S. Lewis had an argument from reason, um, which maybe the presuppositionalists can use. But anyway, Tim talked me out of that as part of our dating. Our dating was very, had this very intellectual component because we were both interested in these things. And just very naturally, that's going to take you to epistemology. Right. If you become an evidentialist, if you leave presuppositionalism behind in Christianity and your interest in whether it can be defended or not, you're almost bound to become an epistemologist when you make that move. And so that was always his interest, and it was always my interest. And so then, very naturally, when we started co-writing, we were writing in classical epistemology. And then there were these things we were interested in that we couldn't really model very well. And we actually changed our mind about like modeling mutual support. If you go out there, you'll find an old article that we wrote as classical epistemologists modeling mutual support.
Mhm.
And it's wrong. It's incorrect. And so then we became interested in probability theory and formal epistemology, partly because of that, our interest in modeling mutual support, and partly because of our interest in intelligent design. It's this kind of weird biographical fact that we became very interested in and thought the evidence was good for intelligent design in biology. But it was being modeled at that time in what's called a neo-Fisherian way by William Dembski.
Yeah.
And something about that, it didn't sound right. And so then we got involved in Bayesian formal epistemology, partly for that. And we presented a Bayesian model instead of the argument for design. So those were different strands that kind of went and fed into our moving from classical to formal epistemology.
And you mentioned that epistemology is very much like a Cartesian view, this kind of like the self first. What thinkers do you think were most fundamental to shaping your early interests?
Well, interestingly enough, Karl Popper, which is probably not what you expected me to say.
No.
So my husband was a Popperian when he was an undergraduate. He also went through a G.E. Moore stage, which is
Hmm.
very un-Cartesian, right? I can still remember him. I was at a desk and his standing next to me and going, "This is a hand. This is another hand." Famous G.E. Moore example. Um, that he didn't hold for as long. He went more to no, we got to go in a more foundationalist position. But when we moved to Nashville and he started studying philosophy in at um, Vanderbilt, he was Popperian, and one of his dissertation, I don't think he was his director, but on his committee, continued to be more Popperian, and at one point said to Tim something like, "Do you ever change your mind?" And he said, "Yeah, when I came here, I was a Popperian, and now I'm not anymore." So that shift kind of took place there, and Descartes became more of an influence, and then his dissertation was a new attack upon classical, or not attack upon, but presentation of classical strong foundationalism. And so then, he influenced me there as well. Bertrand Russell was an influence there as well. I like a phrase that Russell says something about that when you start talking about the external world, you've introduced the serpent into the scientist's garden. That,
Yes.
because and it's funny because just as we were going, full bore classical foundationalism, the world of analytic philosophy was going full bore naturalized epistemology. And so it was inevitable, right, that we would move from foundationalism in object level epistemology to the question of meta theory, meta foundationalism uh, in where we're talking about externalism versus internalism, right? So internalism just fits extremely well with classical foundationalism on the object level as well. And so then our second book, um, The Architecture of Reason, was meta foundationalism, a defense of meta foundationalism.
And you mentioned that you went to Bible college. So that would mean that Christianity and this idea of Christian thought really came to you before philosophy did. How do you think that affected you? How did philosophy really affect learning more about philosophy affect your faith?
Right. I mean, in a big way. And one of them was leaving, rejecting presuppositionalism,
Hmm.
right? And becoming an evidentialist. I don't like to psychoanalyze people, but I can speak for myself. I found that scary,
Hmm.
to say, oh, I thought I could just assume that Christianity was true and the Bible was God's word. In fact, I thought that was the right thing to do.
Hmm.
And now I'm supposed to be, defending this stuff, and it really kind of, ooh.
Hmm.
Um, and we even went through a strange intervening period. A lot of people don't know this, but where um, there was this concept of meeting God. It was like a primary religious experience that I claimed to have had. So the idea being, okay, I'm an evidentialist, but I've met God. And so now that's how come, I can give these probabilistic arguments for Christianity, but this is how I can be certain. And I didn't get that from like Alvin Plantinga or that was something Tim and I kind of developed ourselves. But of course, it kind of similar to
Yeah.
Plantinga's sensus divinitatis or whatever. That it was just coincidental coming up with a similar idea. Um, and it took a few years, but finally at a certain point I said to Tim, I don't think I've really had an un, undoubtable uh personal experience of meeting God. Like
Mhm.
I've been saying this for several years, I'm not even sure it's true. And then at that point I felt I could let go of that and
Mhm.
go more just fully evidential. And even when we were in Nashville, Tim introduced the idea of multiple lines of evidence for the same conclusion, even though we weren't heavily into probability theory at that point, but the way that independent lines of evidence can just uh, blossom into a strong cumulative case that's much stronger than its component parts
Mhm.
taken separately. Okay. And that was, and John Warwick Montgomery, my goodness, the arch evidentialist in in Christian apologetics. I mean, that guy, he just died recently. He was a huge influence on Tim, and through Tim, influence on me as well. So yeah, it did affect it. But the great thing that's happened as the decades have gone on is that I've become more and more confident in the evidential case for Christianity, um, while supporting it in these more and more sophisticated ways. And that's been a cool thing. And so I try to tell people, because so many people struggle with this, you don't have to have Cartesian certainty in something to have extremely powerful evidence. I mean, I don't have Cartesian certainty, but I'm talking to you right now. Right. I mean, technically, it's logically possible that I could be, in a simulation or whatever, right? A
Yeah.
Cartesian deceiver
Yeah.
scenario.
A
Uh,
demon could be
a
deceiving you.
demon could be deceiving me, or maybe just you're fake. I don't know,
Mhm.
like, but I don't really think that,
Yeah.
right? Right. So that very, very strong non-deductive evidence can give you confidence that older writers called moral certainty, which is different from Cartesian certainty. It's the certainty that, quote unquote, certainty that we use in matters of daily life. I suppose it would be used at a legal level beyond reasonable doubt,
Mhm.
confidence beyond reasonable doubt. And that is uh, more than sufficient in matters of religion as well.
Mhm. Well, a Cartesian might say that, well, Descartes, he proves the existence of this
Mm,
self-thinking thing, but he
mm.
then uses that same kind of foundation and ontology to prove the existence of God and then to prove the existence of everything in the outside world.
Right. Now he took that a different direction, right? He held that because God is good,
Hmm.
God could not be a
Yeah.
deceiver. Now I also think that Berkeley is wrong. Okay, Berkeley and idealism is wrong because Berkeley did supposedly believe in the traditional God who was good, all good. And my strong philosophical opinion is that that's in tension with Berkeley's God, with Berkeley idealism. So then
Hmm.
that's just an analytic matter, that if there's a good God, he's not a deceiver. Um, but part of the issue there was that Descartes didn't have non-deductive forms of reasoning.
Hmm.
And that continued to be an issue all through the next century as well. You know, um, what what kinds of reasoning do we have? Sure, if all we have is deduction,
Hmm.
then okay, maybe you can do some kind of perfect being theology. I've always been intrigued. I think the Kalam argument has something to be said for it. The argument from reason, um, various arguments from there being no metaphysical causal regress, so that there
Hmm.
must be a personal first being. But to Christianity is very intensely specific religion. There was this specific person who lived at a certain time, right? So for many of these things, and I would say especially for being confident that a good God exists and wants a relationship with us, kind of a thick theism, you're going to want information
Hmm.
that's going to come in a non-deductive way. And it took a while. I mean, the Reverend Bayes, I don't remember what year he was writing it. I think the later 18th century, if I'm not mistaken,
I believe so.
1700s. Yeah. So you really needed um, induction and then inverse reasoning and all these other forms of inference to get beyond Descartes' arguments for the
Mhm.
existence of God
Yeah.
and do even better than that for a kind of stronger form of theism.
Yeah. And of course, Descartes' rival school was the empiricists that said, induction is not possible. You cannot do induction.
Right?
But
People don't know that about the empiricists, but Hume definitely did say that, yes.
yeah, you can't even know that the sun will rise tomorrow. You can't say that under like a Humean empiricist view.
Which is kind of interesting considering his argument against miracles. His very famous argument against miracles. He's like, there he has his induction hat on,
Hmm.
right? In his argument against miracles, he claims, that the entire uh, experience of mankind is against miracles. It's like, I thought you said induction couldn't be justified. What is that? So, and he said we couldn't help using induction, like that it kind of, even though we can't defend it, we find ourselves almost psychologically compelled to use it or whatever. But he didn't think it was defensible. In our meta-epistemology book, we actually give a different kind of defense for induction against the Humean argument. Of course, you could also say that Descartes is reacting to the Thomists. So you've got, your three
Mm-hmm.
different, you got Thomism, uh, rationalism, Cartesian rationalism, and sort of English or British empiricism going on there. So you've got many different schools during that 100-year period.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned Thomism and Aquinas. I'm interested to ask you because you mentioned how, you're writing evidentially and you had this like religious experience kind of. And Aquinas, of course, he's famously writing the Summa Theologia, and he spends so long writing it, and then he ends up having this religious experience and just stops writing it. He just goes, it's all straw. It doesn't mean anything because of that experience. I'd be curious to know how you'd feel about that with your more evidential point of view.
Well, of course, we don't know what his experience was like. That was not in his writings. That's
Yeah.
reported of his biography. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I think it did, but very much toward the end of his life. And so we don't know exactly what he meant by that or why he said it. Um, and I don't know that he meant that he was wrong.
Hmm.
Okay, that his philosophy was wrong, but it could have been a comparative statement, right? That compared with the beatific vision,
Hmm.
all, all his earthly works were feeble or something like
Yeah.
that, right? Rather than being incorrect or wrong or something he shouldn't have been doing or whatever like that. Um, I have now sort of admitted that I have never had an extremely strong religious experience that I could, certainly not anything I would ever pit against evidence.
Hmm.
If I thought the evidence went the other way, it'd be like, too bad. But I also think that, once we get our direction of inference correct, you can have experiences where you can say, okay, because I have reason on my side already here, I can then take these experiences and give God thanks for them,
Hmm.
even though I'm not sure, uh, I wouldn't be independently certain that this came from God as opposed to being a product of my own mind or whatever.
Right.
Nonetheless, now I'm evidentially a Christian, and so it's like that direction of reasoning goes that direction that if I look at a rose or I hear a song or I see a sunset or whatever, and I just feel, gratitude welling up, or I just feel like, beauty is so amazing, and I give glory and praise to God. But not because that's going against reason or because that's like an extremely strong thing by itself or independently.
Mhm. And to kind of bring us back to the central point of this discussion, what would you say is really the point, the principal point of doing philosophy?
Wow, that's a good question. I do it because I think it's my calling.
Mhm.
It's a vocation. Doing it and applying it to matters of importance, you know. Um, but I think the philosophical mind can have a point even for people for whom it is not a calling.
Mhm.
And I guess what I would say in that case, it's that the point is developing certain intellectual virtues. And these virtues would be things like a devotion to clarity, a devotion to truth, a devotion to evidence, um, and a devotion to never telling lies to yourself. I think this is very important. There's a novel I like where one character tells the other, the lies you tell yourself go as deep as death. And I think that's really profound. And that's why throughout my life thus far, I've tried, especially since and I've felt that philosophy is really important here. Never say, you've had an experience that you haven't had. Never say, you know, oh yeah, that's what I meant all along. Don't be afraid to say, I was wrong. I've changed my mind about that rather than sort of retconning your own intellectual history to make it sound like you've never had to change your mind. And I think that if ordinary people devoted themselves to those intellectual virtues, it would be of great value. Never, it would be important in politics. Never admire someone who's just lying to the public, whoever that may be, and don't become that person yourself. Don't equivocate on terms so that to your own advantage or to the advantage of your own party or tribe. That's inexcusable. Just get a notion of what I might call these intellectual sins, if I can use a theological term there. And so in some ways, I think that's an important central point to
Mhm.
philosophy, to sort of cleaning up your own act intellectually and in your way of dealing with other people.
Right. And less broadly, why do you think today in our society philosophy matters?
Well, I think we're really descending into irrationality.
Mm,
Um, I can remember a moment. It happened to be during the Clinton presidency, but I'm not making a partisan political point here by any means. But there was a moment where I realized people didn't really care whether he was lying or not. And that in a way there was almost an admiration for a person who was clever at telling a lie.
mhm.
Um, that's the old saying, he may be an SOB, but he's our SOB or whatever,
Yeah.
how that saying goes. And unfortunately, I find this on all different sides that truth and lying are becoming unimportant, and the distinction there is becoming unimportant. Of course, the rise of AI is a big deal here too. People who just say, I have a real relationship with my AI companion. And I'm like, what? What what are you saying? And that people really, in a sense, don't care.
Mhm.
They want to feel a certain way, or they want their side to win, or um, you know, they want to have certain experiences. And so they'll sacrifice their own intellectual clarity for that purpose.
Mhm.
And it's just horrifying to me. And I've known, of course, for a long time that that's a temptation of human beings, but it does seem to be accelerating here in the year 2025 on multiple different fronts, that people don't care about truth. And so I think philosophy is extra important there because we definitely should care about truth. Here, I mean, by the way, analytic philosophy. I,
Mhm.
I am never talking about postmodernism. Indeed, one of the reasons that I'm so disturbed by this abandonment of truth goes all the way back to my years in graduate school. Um, when Tim was in graduate school as well, but postmodernism was taking over in all the humanities, in English as well. I saw it in English literature for sure. And we were sort of on the forefront there. And it's like now to say we live in a postmodern society is, in a sense, true. Those things have broken out of the academy. They've broken out of the ivory tower, and they're coming into all sorts of areas of daily life of perfectly ordinary people. And since I've always hated postmodernism with the passion of a thousand burning suns, um, I'm I'm all the more distressed about that here. And so I'm trying to apply what I think anyone can tell are sort of analytic virtues.
Mhm. I really like that answer. When you were saying it, it kind of reminded me of Socrates and this idea of like, it doesn't really matter what you think. It's just about what the truth is. What can we really know? What really are these things that we're talking about, you know?
Absolutely. I mean, he fought the sophists, and the
Mhm.
sophists are with us today.
They exist eternally, unfortunately.
Hmm.
So,
Definitely.
yeah. And what would you say to somebody who thinks that they have this kind of idea that philosophy is too much into the abstract or not practical?
Well, I guess I would ask them, if someone gets sunk into a fantasy and gets pulled more and more away from reality, and that disturbs you, and you think that's bad, and you're upset for that person, it's like that meme. And now you're doing philosophy, right? You are. in a sense, doing philosophy all the time,
Hmm.
even without realizing it. And so it's good to try to do it well.
That's kind of the broad message I'm getting with all the philosophers I come across is you're always going to do what philosophy is, and you can do it shittily, or you can really do it, you know. You can study it and you can learn and you can apply these tools like logic to make what you're doing already better.
I think that's true. Um, it can be hard, especially if we're talking about probability theory, for goodness sake. But
Hmm.
my YouTube channel has, which is all about New Testament studies and Christianity, but the motto is making common sense rigorous.
Hmm.
And I think that motto, applies more broadly. You know the history of philosophy, so you know that I'm not a Scottish common census, taking
Hmm.
this like back to the 18th century. But on a practical level, I do think that what has been common sense is often correct, but it's good to make it rigorous.
Hmm.
And so I think that can be done. It doesn't even necessarily take formal study. In fact, I'm definitely not advising everybody, quit your day job and go get a degree in philosophy. I often advise people not to do that, but to study logic, and just to ask yourself these two questions. What do you mean? How do you know? Just over and over and over again. And I can remember when Tim and I were first married, they used to just drive me crazy. Tim was always going, "What do you mean? How do you know?" And I'm not necessarily suggesting that you do this with your nearest and dearest. It can get
Hmm.
a little bit, annoying at times, but certainly with oneself, it's good to be saying, "What do I mean? What do I really mean if I'm going to say that? And how do I know?" And just that degree of self-awareness is already helping you to do informal philosophy better.
Right. And that kind of brings me back to this thing we talked about in our brief email exchange, where you fought back a little bit about this idea of philosophy being super duper accessible. I'd love
Mhm.
to know a little bit what you mean by that.
Well, accessible is going to come in different levels for different people, for sure. Um, I definitely don't think the formal categories of philosophy and probability theory are just going to boom, immediately be known. But so I want to be careful about that. I don't want to tell everybody, hey, you know, here we go. I just published a blog post last week. I think it was after you and I had our exchange. Um, and it was an update to our article on the resurrection.
Mhm.
It's long. Somebody printed it out. He said it's 36 pages, single spaced, when he printed it out. And it's got sort of this technical section that I call the primer on independence and dependence and, Bayesian reasoning. And then it's got kind of an application section, and series of sections to the resurrection evidence. And I realized there that, what I'm doing is I'm trying to take this stuff that is not, I would say, intrinsically accessible, and I'm trying to make it more accessible by applying these formal terms and these formal concepts to a specific concrete area.
Hmm.
So I think that takes more work. But at the same time, I agree with you that certain things are being done unconsciously. So, uh, Bayesian priors and likelihoods.
Hmm.
I think we're all constantly, even people who lived before the Reverend Bayes was born and who've never heard of him, they're constantly doing what we might call, a common man's version of that, where you've got, your other evidence over here, and that's influencing the prior. And then you've got some kind of, especially this is especially true in specific events that you have evidence for. Okay. So, someone comes up to you and says, I've just seen someone walking a tiger on a leash in our neighborhood. It's like, what? And so you're immediately going to do your prior and likelihood thing there, even though you don't know those words, even though you don't, you're going to be like, okay, um, could a tiger have escaped from a zoo? Um, is it, could he have seen something that looked like a tiger? Maybe somebody just dressed up their dog or whatever, right? You're considering possible explanations for the concrete evidence, but you've also got all this other stuff here. Nobody in Kalamazoo, Michigan has ever owned a tiger. right? I did once know somebody who owned a boa constrictor, but not a tiger. There are laws about this kind of thing. I'm sure you're not allowed to own a tiger and take it for walks. There's your prior, right? But then this person never plays practical jokes. Like
Mm.
I know this person as well. So this is weird. So presumably he really believes it there. What are we doing there? We're doing your likelihood evaluation, right? So especially with respect to empirical events, I think in a way we're sort of all Bayesians, even without realizing it. And
Yeah.
that goes to your accessibility point to some extent.
Yeah. And what would you say is kind of the biggest misconception people have about what philosophers like yourself and your husband actually do?
Well, I'll give you a joking version and then I'll give you a more serious version. The joking version is that you're at a party. I can't tell you how many times this happened back when I went to parties. I don't really go to parties much anymore. But anyway, you're at a party and somebody asks, what do you do? And like they would ask him, what do you do? And he'd say, I teach philosophy at wherever he taught, at the time. And they'd go, oh, is that kind of like psychology? Seriously, because they both have the same number of syllables and they both start with a P, and it goes there, but the more serious version is that um it's something very woo, that philosophy is something that has no practical relevance.
Hmm.
It's something that ordinary people cannot understand at all. Um, and it's something that we really can't, in a sense, can't afford as as a society. It's like, oh, never mind that.
Mm.
All that nonsense. Let's get on with the doing of daily life. And I sympathize with that. As I said, I don't tell people to try to get a degree necessarily, or if somebody does, I'm like, maybe you ought to double major because the job market's terrible out there, um, but at the same time, it is a common misconception that philosophy is just like totally other. It's
Mhm.
it's way over here, and there's this great gulf fixed between philosophy, whatever the heck that is, and real life. And I might sort of say, yeah, that may be true of continental philosophy, but it's not true of analytic philosophy. Showing my colors there.
Yeah. To kind of bring us back to your faith, how do you think your Christian faith has influenced the philosophical questions that you try to ask?
It's influenced them a lot, but in maybe surprising ways, maybe ways that you wouldn't think.
Mhm.
In in my intellectual history and Tim's as well, what I've found is that again and again, there's been a question of religious or relevant to a question of religious faith or relevant to religious faith, like intelligent design. The designer doesn't have to be God, but it's considered relevant to it because the designer could be God. Um, that has sparked are delving into an area of philosophy, or it's been one factor that sparked it. And yet, always we've had other reasons as well for being interested in it. So, for example, the Cartesian deceiver problem. In many ways, I was interested in mutual support, um, uh, cumulative case arguments, modeling those, uh, and so forth, because I was really interested in whether there was a good answer to Cartesian deceiver scenarios. And I worked on that for decades. So we were pushed by a friend. We hadn't known him very well at the time, but we had met a few times to respond to Alvin Plantinga, interestingly, kind of an intra-Christian dispute. He was promoting Reformed epistemology, which you've probably heard of. It's a version of externalism. And in his book, Warranted Christian Belief, he was really tackling Richard Swinburne's non-reformed probabilistic case for the resurrection of Jesus and saying that just doesn't work. And he was sort of using probability theory. He was using the theorem of total probability, wasn't using Bayes. But anyway, and pushing something he called principle of dwindling probabilities and saying it undermined Swinburne's argument. And so our friend said, you guys are the ones that should answer Plantinga here. And so there, and he was Christian, right? So there's a Christian motivation, but we get interested in it, we get involved in it, and I'm like, you know, okay, this crosshatches with our interest in how to model mutual support,
Mm,
which we had been already interested in. We tried to give a classical epistemology answer to that, in terms of prioritizing different conclusions diachronically. That's the one I told you was wrong,
yeah.
completely independently of any Christian interest. And I'm like, wow. And so I can remember saying to Tim one day, teach me about Jeffrey conditioning. And so I was interested in Jeffrey conditionalizing apropos of modeling mutual support. And then that led to our Arquettes publication on modeling mutual support, as a foundationalist, making mutual support consistent with classical foundationalism, because it was often thought not to be, right? Oh no, this
Yeah.
is a form of coherentism, right? And we were like, no, it's gotta be compatible with classical foundationalism, because we know there's something good about mutual support. We also know that coherentism is wrong. So we got to be able to bring these together. That's not Christian at all. And yet our work in answering Alvin Plantinga was extremely fruitful in that. And the same way for Bayesian probability and intelligent design. Something similar happened. And the same with Bayesian probability and the argument for the resurrection. Tim developed this crucial inequality in our argument on for the resurrection of Jesus, which was published in 2009. I was fascinated by that inequality. And I said, yeah, that could be really relevant to the problem of the external world that I've been struggling with all this time. And so I went and ran with that, and I published a bunch of articles in pure formal epistemology on independence and that inequality, and then eventually published on the problem of the external world. But it started with something that he first published in our article on the resurrection.
Right.
So, yeah, it's been influenced by Christianity, but in this like very, very analytical way that our Christianity and our epistemology have sort of been mutually fruitful in pushing us into areas of research.
You'll sometimes hear this idea within apologetics that philosophical arguments are like secondary. They're just like reinforcing the belief that you already have, and that
Mhm.
a philosophical argument isn't really gonna convince somebody of a different position with like belief in God. Have
Mhm.
there really been philosophical arguments that strengthen your own Christian conviction?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Back, like I say, even when we were not working yet in formal epistemology, the idea of independent witnesses was
Mm,
already important. Um, but then we did that in our 2009 article, which was very Bayesian. But then we realized that acceptance of the what would I've called the reportage model, I'm not going to go into it in detail, but of the Gospels was not widespread in New Testament studies. We had gotten a faulty impression on that from reading Gary Habermas,
mm.
whose research since then I very strongly criticized because I think he
Yeah,
gives
you do.
in, inaccurate impressions on that. And so we just said, well, the heck with consensus then. Let's just go for it. And so then Tim pulled in arguments from the 18th century and the 19th century, that had been lost, like the argument from undesigned coincidences. And then we gave them I published an article on undesigned coincidences and a Bayesian modeling in Arquettes, myself, totally secular. I didn't give any Christian examples. They were hypothetical examples. But anyway, so that has tremendously strengthened my faith, my conclusion that the uh, accuracy of the Gospels and Acts, at least,
Hmm.
can be strongly evidentially defended, and that defense can even be modeled probabilistically. So that's absolutely true. I've also known of people who have converted for intellectual reasons. I know people who have um, personally converted
Right.
for intellectual reasons. So even as a sociological statement, that shouldn't be overgeneralized. Nobody changes their minds.
Hmm.
or because of arguments. Of course, people change their minds because of arguments. And then finally, a mere psychological and sociological statement doesn't have normative force anyway.
Yeah.
Maybe people should convert for intellectual reasons, even if very few of them do. And I'm more concerned about whether they should than whether they do.
Well, the two that you mentioned, I maybe would push back that they're philosophical. You mentioned the independent witnesses and of the, was it Luke? It was Acts that you said?
Well, I said the Gospels and Acts. I just
Yeah.
wanted to include all five
Right, right,
documents.
right. To me, those seem like more historical arguments and looking at the texts and trying to define historicity and what really happened. What I'm really talking about is like these, as you mentioned before, the Kalam and like first cause, first
Mhm.
mover arguments. Those are really more philosophical, and you can like do them in an armchair, void of these texts. That's
Mhm.
really more what I mean when I say philosophical arguments.
Well, that's been an interest on Tim's and my part as well, is to coordinate those two things.
Hmm.
And those two things definitely need to be coordinated. Some years ago, Philosophy of Christie did a special issue on what they called, oh man, I'm not going to be able to remember the phrase now. Richard Swinburne coined it. Augmented, I think was the word. Augmented uh, philosophy of religion, something like that. Augmented philosophy of religion arguments for Christianity, some phrase like that. I know I don't have it quite right. But so that then included these more purely philosophical arguments that you're talking about. And it also included things like I did an article there on the argument from prophecy, um, which would be more historical, right?
Yeah.
Whether a given prophecy has been fulfilled or not, you're obviously going to have to look at history. Um, to my mind, those need to be coordinated. And I think focusing too much on what you might call the pure philosophical arguments can lead to distortions.
Mm.
So here's a very important distortion that I've published on, and it goes like this. You can't use a historical argument to support theism unless you independently know that God would want to make contact with man and would want to perform a miracle to verify his contact with man. Now, I'm not saying that we know he wouldn't. I'm not saying that, yeah, even if you just think that's absolutely impossible, obviously, if that's impossible, that God would want to do that. Now we have a problem because zero can't be raised. Zero is a sticky probability, right? Um, but that's wrong. And I think the reason that people have gotten that idea is because of the popularity of those purely philosophical arguments, that they're like, okay, those arguments need to take us really far to the point where we can actually predict. It's almost a kind of neo-Popperianism
Hmm.
because Popper said, you must have predictions, right? That you must have, and he meant it in a strong sense. He didn't just mean some kind of probability. He meant a strong prediction, that you must be able to predict that God would um, make contact with man and so forth. And so while I'm not opposed to those arguments, as I say, I think there's virtue and value in some of them. They should never let us uh, treat theism as something that has to be defended up to, this level
Mm.
first by those arguments alone before, so that, like, the prior has to be higher than 50%. That's something you'll sometimes hear,
Yeah.
right? That before you investigate the concrete evidence for a miracle, the prior for that miracle must be above 50%. Why? I mean, so I have an article called Of Generic Gods and Generic Men that's out there, and I think you can get it for free. Anyway, I have a draft version on my website for free, but I think actually the published version is accessible for free. And I say in there, when someone first contacts me and he gives me his name, and this is a real person, by the way, Antti Tirik, I asked his permission to use his name. So I first get an email from someone named Antti Tirik who said he's a Croatian. I don't need to have a generic Croatian argument previously that says, uh, Croatians exist, and if Croatians exist, they will want to send me an email. And, if there exists a Croatian named Auntie, he will send me an email, and that has to be above 50%. No, like even if I've never heard of Croatia, I can get an email from somebody saying, I'm from this country of Croatia, and I may be, like, suppose I'm ignorant, uh, and then that's evidence. That's very strong evidence that this country exists and that this specific Croatian exists. And so I think the same can be true of Christianity. So I don't want to diss purely philosophical arguments, but I also think it's important that their importance not be exaggerated.
Mm, right. So their importance is kind of secondary to this historical point, which Christianity really focuses around.
Um, I want to be careful about using secondary and primary, but yeah, as far as giving a strong reason for that historical point, you're going to need historical evidence,
Mhm.
and historical evidence can be really strong, even aside from those prior arguments. We have argued that the evidence for the resurrection can overcome even a very low prior probability
Mhm.
for the resurrection, even though I don't in fact think the prior is that low,
Right.
right? But I think all of these things can be coordinated, they can work together, and I think that's important.
What philosophical questions do you think Christians should be thinking about or asking more today?
Oh, that's a good question. I think they should be asking how they themselves know Christianity is true. That doesn't mean I'm trying to get everybody to become mentally disturbed. And I want to be careful about this. I have encountered religious OCD. There is such a thing as religious OCD and ideological OCD, where a person, maybe someone who's been a Christian before, they assume that the way to be cautious is to be an agnostic about Christianity. And that's not what I'm saying here. In fact, agnosticism is itself a position about the probability, right? I mean, it's saying the probability is, right around 50%. Okay, so if you say I'm an agnostic, you're putting a ceiling on that probability. And certainly being a skeptic is not being cautious. Okay, because if you're saying, I don't think Christianity is true, you're taking a position as well. Okay, so when I say they should ask themselves how they know, I don't mean to say, okay, got to go out there and deconvert, or you got to go out there and say, okay, I'm an agnostic now, but to inquire. I think you should inquire
Mhm.
into the evidence for your faith. And then I think they should be asking, okay, if there's good evidence, can I make this clear to other
Mhm.
people? And those are things, I've tried to ask myself as well.
And where does that bring you? Because what kind of came to mind when you were saying that is this idea of like skeptical theism. What do you think about
Mm.
somebody who might be like a skeptical theist about things that they're unsure about within their religious?
Okay, so you're talking about the skeptical theism position in Problem of Evil? Yeah, because that's
Sure.
where it's usually
Yeah,
used.
I'd
That's
say
where the
that's.
phrase is used. In fact, I've just written an article for a special issue of Philosophy of Christie on skeptical theism. So,
Mhm.
and it hasn't been published yet, so I want to be careful. I don't want to say everything, but this is something I've said in public as well. So skeptical theism takes the position that if Christianity were true, we wouldn't expect to know God's reasons, or I guess you'd say if theism is true, we wouldn't expect to know God's reasons. That, God is beyond our comprehension. I know there's skeptical theists out here watching this right now, and they're like, "That's a straw man." I'm oversimplifying a bit here, but that you would expect to not know God's reasons for
Mhm.
doing things. And I think that can be taken in a weaker and a stronger sense. In a weaker sense, it's fine. In a stronger sense, it's not fine. The weaker sense is just that you're not going to expect to know God's specific reasons for each specific evil. Okay, so in my own case, you're probably aware of this. In 2021, I
Mhm.
suffered an
Yes.
injury, and so I'm in pain all the time. You know, and this gets in the way of my doing the work that I think God has called me to do. And I can remember saying, Lord, I could do so much more for you if you would get rid of this, right? So,
Mhm.
I don't know God's specific reasons, or at least not all of them, for letting this happen to me and for not healing me. He could heal me if he wanted
Mhm.
to. Um, but I think we can know categories of reasons, soul making, um, testimony to others, um, helping others, whatever, all these things. And I think the Bible talks about these. So um, the the stronger position that we just don't know at all, I think, does have a consequence, which Nevin Klimenhaga, I don't know if you've heard of him.
I
He
don't
was
believe
a,
so.
a student of my husband's, actually, and he's gone on to become just a fine philosopher. Just he's very brilliant, and he's a Christian. At least as far as I know, he still is. He
Mhm.
certainly was when he was here, and I think he still is. But criticizing skeptical theism and saying, look, if you take this strong skeptical theist position, that we have no idea even what the floor is of the interval for God allowing evil, so we can have an interval valued probability, right? But if it's the entire interval from 0 to 1
Mhm.
with no measure placed over that interval, okay, Nevin says, then you can't take other evidence into account either.
Mhm.
Okay, because if you have this complete lack of knowledge, and so for all you know, the evidence of evil could actually entail the falsity of Christianity.
Yeah.
Okay, then other evidence can't have its impact. And he's right about that. He's got an article about that, and I interact with that in the article I'm writing. And so I think that we should do Christian theism instead. And so once we have independent evidence for a specific version of theism that has categories for God's permitting evil, then in a sense you can even take a bit of a hit from the evidential problem of evil. And this is true in science as well. Scientific theories have counter evidence,
Mhm.
and yet that scientific theory can nonetheless be overwhelmingly justified on the basis of total evidence. And so this is related to something I did an article about on ad hocness. Okay, so there I talked about formal ad hocness and argumentative ad hocness. Argumentative ad hocness is where you refuse to admit the impact of any counter evidence,
Mhm.
and you just retrofit your theory over and
Yeah.
over again. And that's what we usually mean when we say this is ad hoc. Formal ad hocness is where your theory takes a hit. But if it's just formal ad hocness, you can say, okay, yeah, my theory took a hit, but I've got all this other evidence, and therefore, on the basis of total evidence, I believe
Mhm.
that my theory is still right. And so
Right.
I think there is some disconfirmation to Christianity from the evidential problem of evil. I
Mhm.
don't, I think we whittle it down. I don't think it's overwhelming or anything like that. But I also think that we have so much evidence for Christian theism, particularly, that it sort of, in a way, pays its way, because
Mhm.
Christian theism is justified as opposed to other versions of theism,
Yeah.
which are in fact refuted by the evidential problem of evil, like a God who makes everybody happy, for example. That's obviously refuted, or a God who isn't going to let his servants suffer. We just know that's not true. So then, so Christian theism, which has a very strong theory of suffering, very strong theology of suffering and God's purposes in suffering, it sort of benefits, in a sense, from the refutation of those other versions of theism, just as happens in all kinds of probabilistic cases.
And maybe those critiques of skeptical theism are just more broadly critiques of any kind of skeptical philosophical worldview, you know? It's just so difficult to derive knowledge when you have this kind of opinion that you can't derive. You can't really discuss these ideas, you know?
Yeah, especially if you put it in probabilistic terms, right?
Yeah.
You're never going to go anywhere, right? If you think that we can never have historical knowledge, well, then you don't know what you had for supper last night. I mean, that's already historical knowledge,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's not just ancient historical knowledge. So that's true. I'm not sure that, skeptical theism has this kind of narrow meaning, but I definitely think it is important to push people. And I do this with um, skeptics, for example, who take the position that everything needs to be doubly attested. in ancient history. And that there is no principle that you have to have at least two sources for every event in ancient history. And I'll give like specific examples, like the customs of the Germanic tribes. Tacitus is our only source,
Yeah.
right? And so do we like, no, can't possibly know this custom of this Germanic tribe that he talked about because he's our only source. And it's just ridiculous. If the source has some credibility, why not? You don't have to always have a second source. And so I'll try to shake people out of various double standards that I think they sometimes use in religious discussions. And that's true of some Christians as well. But at the moment, I'm thinking of examples from skeptics.
Yeah. Or even like Thucydides, like who is really the only person during the Peloponnesian War who's writing things down and making these historical writings for us to know there's really not other people there.
I'm
My
sure there are specific things that Thucydides is our only source for. The examples are not springing to mind, but I'm sure there are some for sure that they're, um, yeah, the argument from silence is really bad. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, the last question I have for you is what advice would you give to a young person who's just beginning to study philosophy?
Hmm. Well, keep your day job. That's my first advice. That's very pragmatic, very practical. But um, I guess I would say find that psychological balance, and this is important, between examining the foundations of your own knowledge and becoming unhealthy.
Mm.
And, 30 years ago, I wouldn't necessarily have thought I needed to put it that way. When the internet was just revving up, 30, 40 years ago, I would have been like, de devote yourself, pour yourself into your philosophy, night and day, right? Because I thought that, carelessness or being too caught up in the things of this life, was the greater danger. What you might almost call an ascetical approach to
Yeah.
to philosophy, right? But now what I've seen is the other danger, which is people, they just become caught in their own heads. And, philosophy can be its own version of the problem of being, say, a video gamer, where, you spend an unhealthy amount of time, like everything is about your video games or whatever. Um, Go outside, get out, get off your phone, get off your computer, and think about things, but think about them in relation to what you're knowing and seeing, and in relation to other people, and don't become mentally unhealthy in your devotion to philosophy, while at the same time trying hard to exhibit those intellectual virtues we've talked about.
Yeah. You got to collect your priors.
Yeah, that's true too. That's absolutely true. And you also have to not be a jerk, be a good person, and
Yeah.
have friends, have real friends, have friends you can touch,
Hmm.
you know.
Yeah, and I think have friends philosophically who you might disagree with. We
Yeah,
disagree about this
right.
topic that we've really been discussing, but I think we
Hmm.
still had a great conversation, a very
Yeah,
productive.
absolutely.
And I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Dr. McGrew. This was great.
Thanks for having me, Daniel.
Thank you. I hope we speak again. Have a
Okay,
great one.